Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome to the Airbus Beginners tutorial series. The aim of this series is to help get you in the air in the default Airbus A320 within Microsoft Flight Simulator and give you the required knowledge to simulate a flight from A to B within the sim. As the name would suggest, this series is very much aimed at people who are new to the Airbus, so we're not looking to learn every single system and procedure in minute detail. That being said, we will still try and follow real-world Airbus procedures as closely as possible. If you are looking for something a little bit more in-depth and a little bit more realistic, then please check out my other tutorial series on the channel, my Airbus Procedures tutorial series. Anyway, now let's head to the flight deck of the A320 and begin the lesson. So once again, welcome back to the flight deck of the default A320. As you can see now, we are in the cruise. We're still over southern England at the moment. We're going to discuss the Autopilot and the MCDU in a little bit more depth. Just before we begin discussing the systems, it'd be quite nice to outline the philosophy or the logic behind the differences between using the Autopilot or the flight computer to control the aircraft. Essentially, if we want to make any short-term changes to the aircraft's current flight path, so for example if we wanted to change the speed or the heading on a short-term basis, we would use the Autopilot or the FCU to make those selections. If we want to make a longer-term change to the aircraft's flight path, then generally speaking we would do that using the MCDU. Again, the MCDU has quite limited functionality in the default A320, but we'll briefly look at the pages that are available to us during the flight and what we can do with those in order to help us fly the aircraft. So back down to the MCDU once again, you can see we're currently on the cruise page at the moment. We'll start by looking at the flight plan page. So as you can see, we have the current flight plan with all the active waypoints. Once again, to scroll through the flight plan, we can use the up and down arrow keys. We can look at each waypoint and we can make our selections by clicking on the individual waypoint as required. We'll discuss this in a bit more depth momentarily. We can also insert our arrival route by clicking on the bottom left prompt of the flight plan and selecting arrival. Again, we'll discuss that in a bit more depth later on. We have the RadNav page, so up here we can manually tune VORs or even the ILS on the RadNav page, and they should show up on the navigation display. However, I found that this doesn't really seem to be working currently in Microsoft Flight Simulator. The performance page, so again we have the cruise performance page. The descent page where we can put in a selected speed for the descent, or we can choose to fly in managed speed. Again, if we want to make a long-term change to the descent speed, we would insert that in the MCDU, and if we wanted to make a short-term change to the speed, we would select that using the Autopilot. And then the approach page where we fill in the weather for the arrival airport as well as the decision altitude for the ILS. Again, we'll talk about that more later on. The only other page I suppose worth mentioning is the direct to page. We can use that to select any waypoint on our flight plan and go direct to that waypoint. So if we wanted to cut the corner, or we were cleared direct to a waypoint by default air traffic in Microsoft Flight Simulator, we could use that to fly straight to the waypoint. The flight plan unfortunately is a bit buggy at the moment. This distance should give us our current distance from our present position to the destination. Very useful for helping you to work out your descent. However, as I mentioned, it doesn't seem to work currently. It just gives you the distance from your departure point, so unfortunately it makes it much more difficult to manage the descent at the moment in the default A320. So that's basically all the pages that you have available to you in the default MCDU. So now we have a decent view of both the navigation display and the MCDU. We can just discuss a few more functions of the MCDU with a more visual explanation of how they work. So most of the functionality that you do have available in the default MCDU is on the flight plan page. So first example, if we wanted to clear out waypoint Zamab, we can click on clear, click on waypoint Zamab. That will then give us the prompt to either insert or erase that modification. So we'll insert that. And as you can see, waypoint ZAMAB has now been cleared out of the flight plan. So now you can see we are flying direct from Hawk to waypoint View. If we wanted to insert a waypoint instead of clearing a waypoint, we can also do that. So if we want to insert a waypoint, we would click on the waypoint before the waypoint that we want to insert, so in this case waypoint Hawk. And then we type in the waypoint we want to add, so ZAMAB, and then we can put that as next waypoint. And again we get the option to either erase or insert. We'll insert that. And as you can see, waypoint ZAMAB is now back in the flight plan. And that's the basic functionality you actually have with the flight plan as it stands. In the real aircraft, obviously a lot more functionality, but in terms of what you can simulate currently with the default Airbus, those are the two most useful functions you'll probably find. With the direct to function, as I said, we can go direct to any waypoint that we like. So for example, if we wanted to cut this short corner here between waypoint View and waypoint Impacts, we could go direct to waypoint Impacts. To do that, we just click on direct to, and then we find waypoint Impacts in the flight plan. So there's Impacts, click on the prompt next to Impacts, and you can see now that on the flight plan we have a temporary flight plan drawn out with a yellow line. Again, we can either erase that if we've made the wrong decision, or we can insert it. So we'll insert that now and go direct to Impacts. And the aircraft should turn direct to Impacts. There you go, so you can now see the flight plan direct to Impacts, and the active waypoint on the navigation display is Impacts. For the RadNav page, as I mentioned, you should be able to tune in the frequency of any VORs close by, and that will give you VR information on the bottom left or right hand side of the navigation display. But currently I can't seem to get that to work in Microsoft Flight Simulator, so I'm not sure how useful that will be to you. So that pretty much covers the default MCDU as it stands. Next we'll come up and cover the Autopilot. So here we have the controls for the Autopilot. The panel itself is known as the FCU. We'll quickly run through each button on the Autopilot and discuss its function, and then again we'll come back to the primary flight display and we'll go through some visual representations of how each mode works. So we'll start on the left and work our way to the right. This button, the Speed Mac button, that basically lets us choose between selected speed or Mac. Just to give you an example right now, so if we wanted to go to a selected speed, we pull the selector, and then currently we're in Mach, so Mach decimal 78, we can press the button and that will select a speed of 275 knots. We'll go back into manage speed for now. So while we're talking about manage and selected speeds, what does that actually mean? Well, the Airbus Autopilot is actually rather intuitive once you get used to it. Basically all of the main four selectors, so the speed, the heading, the altitude and the vertical speed, they can either be pulled out or pushed in. If you pull the knob out, then essentially it's like pulling the control towards you. You're giving yourself control over the aircraft. And if you push the button in, it's like pushing towards the aircraft. You're giving the aircraft control of that particular parameter. So for example, for the speed, if we pull, we're now using selected speed. We can adjust, well currently we're in selected Mach. We can adjust the Mach up and down as we like, and the aircraft will comply. If we push the button back in, we'll go back into managed speed. Same for the heading. If we pull, we can go into a selected heading, adjust the aircraft's heading left or right. And if we want the aircraft to go back into its own navigation mode, we'll push the heading selector and it will go back into nav. The loc button, we don't use that awfully often, to be honest. We only use that for a localizer only approach. Heading track and VS FPA, that just changes the aircraft mode between heading and VS or track and FPA. We really only use track FPA for flying non-precision approaches. And as you can see, it's actually in-op in the default A320. Autopilot 1 and 2, obviously they control the aircraft's autopilot. They do exactly the same thing. We can switch between one autopilot or the other. Generally, if the captain's flying, we'll use autopilot 1, and if the first officer's flying, we'll use autopilot 2. Auto thrust, obviously that can turn the aircraft's auto thrust system on or off, allowing the aircraft to manage the thrust for us. Not awfully common that we'll actually press this button. The auto thrust comes on automatically when we set the takeoff thrust, and it will disengage automatically when we reduce the thrust for the landing. So we very rarely need to push this button ourselves. There's also an auto thrust disconnect push button on the thrust levers. So really the only time we'll press this button is if we need to re-engage the auto thrust in the cruise for some reason. Next we have the altitude selector knob. You can't really see it here very clearly, but there's a black ring behind the white selector knob. We can use that to change between increments of 100 or 1000. So currently, for example, it's on 100. So we can change our altitude by hundreds of feet. And then if we put it on 1000, we're changing the aircraft's altitude by thousands of feet. Very much the same again for the altitude selector knob. If we push the knob in, then we're giving the aircraft full control of the profile management. So whether it's a climb or a descent, the aircraft will perform based on data in the flight computer, and it will try and meet any altitude restrictions that we've given it in the flight computer. If we pull the selector, then essentially we're taking control from the aircraft, and the aircraft will either climb or descend as fast as it possibly can. Metric altimetry. This button allows us to display our altitude in meters on the primary flight display. We can just click that on and off, and that will give us an altitude in meters, as some countries around the world will use meters for altitude. Vertical speed, slightly different from the other selectors. If we push the vertical speed button, it will actually level off the aircraft. If we pull, then we're selecting a vertical speed mode. Approach, so we only use this for flying an approach in the aircraft. Once we press approach, it will basically allow the aircraft to guide itself using the ILS or the various approaches that we put in the flight computer, whether that's a GPS approach or a VOR approach. For all these selectors, it's all the same logic. If we turn it to the left, then we decrease the value, and if we turn it to the right, then we increase the value. So now we'll look at a few visual examples of how each of these modes work. So now we can see the primary flight display and the navigation display. So we'll start with the speed again. So we'll go for a selected speed, so we'll pull out the speed knob. That gives us a selected Mach of Mach decimal 78. If we want to change that to a selected speed, we push the speed Mach button, and now you can see we have a selected speed of 277 knots. To reduce the speed, we just twist the knob to the left, and the aircraft speed will start to reduce, the aircraft thrust coming back. And to increase the speed again, we just twist the knob to the right, and you'll see the thrust start to increase, and eventually the aircraft speed will start to increase again. If we want to go back to managed speed, then we'll just push in the speed knob and we go back to managed speed. You can see when the aircraft's in a managed mode that we just have these three dashes and a dot symbology. That shows that we're in a managed mode. For the heading, currently we are in nav mode, as you can see, so the aircraft is following our flight plan track as per what's programmed in the MCDU. If for some reason we wanted to fly a heading, whether that's for weather deviation or maybe air traffic control vectoring, once again we pull out the knob to go into selected mode. We can see we're in selected mode as we now have a number in the window. We're currently on a heading of 139. If we want to turn left, we turn the knob to the left, and if we want to turn right, we turn the knob to the right. And then again, if we want to go back into a managed mode, as long as we're close enough to our flight plan track, we can just press the button and we'll go back into nav. If we're further away from the flight plan track, we might have to take a heading to bring us back towards the flight plan track. or we can use the direct to function in the MCDU to go to any waypoint on our flight plan route. Autopilot, so currently we're in Autopilot 1, we can change over, as I said, to Autopilot 2, makes absolutely no difference at this stage in the flight. For our altitude, we're currently at flight level 350. If we wanted to descend, we'll just descend for a couple of hundred feet for now, so we put the selector in hundreds of feet. We can select, let's go to 3,500 feet, and if we want the aircraft to do a managed descent, then we'll push the selector. If we wanted to do an unmanaged descent, we'll pull the selector. Currently right now it will make very little difference. As I mentioned, a managed descent will try and meet any restrictions that we have on the flight plan in terms of altitude. An open descent will ignore all the restrictions and just descend down as quickly as possible. So we'll pull right now for an open descent, and you'll see it should say open descent. There's a bug on the default aircraft. And then we have 34,500 blue. For an open descent, the aircraft's thrust will come all the way back to idle, and then the aircraft will begin a descent, maintaining the managed speed down to 34,500 feet. Once we reach our selected altitude, we'll get out, and then the aircraft will level off and the thrust will come up again to maintain the speed. Similarly, if we want to climb back up to 35,000 feet, we can either pull or push and the aircraft will climb accordingly. But just to demonstrate vertical speed mode now, we'll pull the vertical speed selector. That will give us the vertical speed mode, and then we can turn the vertical speed selector to the right, and that will give us a vertical speed of plus 500 feet. Again, the mode is a little bit buggy right now. We should see 3,500 feet as the altitude on the PFD, and we should see plus 500 feet in the window for vertical speed. But hopefully you get the idea anyway. And then once we reach our cruise altitude of 3,500 feet, we should go back into outcruise. Anyway, just to ensure that the aircraft does actually level off, I'll go for a selected climb now, so I'll pull the altitude selector, and you can see we have outstar and we have 3,500 feet blue. There's outcruise, so once again we're cruising at flight level 350, the speed is managed at 285 knots, and we're in navigation mode, so the aircraft is following the flight plan track. As you can see, the modes are managed and we're at flight level 350. For the approach mode, we'll talk about that more later on when we fly the approach into Nice. So once again, that's a very broad outline of the modes available to us in the cruise, both with the MCDU and the Autopilot. Again, it's not a completely exhaustive description of all the modes available on the real-world Airbus, but it is the functions that the default Airbus gives you in the cruise, and it certainly covers most of the functions that you would need during the cruise on a typical flight in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So I do hope you enjoyed the video, guys, and found it informative. If you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. That really helps the channel to grow, and I really appreciate the support. If you have any comments or questions for me, please leave them down in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. But for now, thanks very much, and I'll see you all again soon.